having classified resources into three categories as they exist in the form of pure public goods, pure private goods and common pool goods or resources, let us see that what kind of management regimes can be established to govern or to manage these resources. So, management regimes are a special kind of institutional arrangements, as I just told that to govern resources we need an institutional arrangements, or to manage resources we need a particular kind of authority structure, and resource management regime is a special kind of institutional arrangement which decides who will use the resource and who will not, which will decide who will decide over the resource and who will not, and which also decide who will own the resource and who will not. So, therefore, resource management regime defines who will have right to access the resource, and it structures the relationship of two individuals for the resource, in the sense that resource management regimes provide rights to individuals and it assigns duties. So, resource management regime is important because resources can be managed under more than one regime. So, the same resource can be managed as a state property, it can be managed as a private property, or it can also be an open access. So, let us see what are the different types of resource management regimes and how resources can be managed in different management regimes or with different institutional arrangements. There are four types of resource management regimes: the private property regime, the state property regime, the common property regime, and finally, the open access resources or open access regime. And the property right arrangements or the resource management regimes, they define the difference between the ownership, the use rights and the decision making rights. So, therefore, under these four resource management regimes, or depending upon the resource management regimes, the ownership rights, the use rights and the decision making rights will vary. Under different management regimes, different kind of agencies and individuals take up these rights, the use rights, ownership rights and the decision making rights. So, let us see how these different kinds of resource management regimes are different and how these three important rights, the ownership right, the use rights and the decision making rights, how they are different in these kind of management regimes. Let us first discuss about the state property regime. In the case of state property regime, the ownership rests with the state. It is the state which owns the property and it is the state which establishes an institutional arrangement over property. In this case, private individuals may use the resource with due permission from the state. In other words, the use rights can rest with citizens or rest with individuals, and decision making can be made by a specialized agency appointed or sanctioned by the state. So, therefore, the three important rights that we discussed, the ownership right, use right and the decision making right, there is a separation of these three kind of rights. So, there is a separation of ownership and management as well as the users of the state property regime. So, therefore, there is a separation of property rights and different agents hold different rights in the case of state property regime. Like I just told that in the case of state property regime, it is the state which owns the resources, it is the individuals who mostly use the resources, and there is a specialized agency, maybe the government department, which decides over the resources. So, therefore, the three important rights that we just discussed, the use right, ownership right and decision making right, are held by three different agents in the case of state property regimes. So, therefore, state property regimes are a kind of institutional arrangement, it is a kind of authority structure over a resource where the ownership right rests with the state, the use rights are mostly with the people or citizens and the decision making right is with a specialized agency or maybe a government department or an agency appointed by the state or the government. Let us see what is private property regime. Private property regime is a kind of institutional arrangement or it is a kind of authority structure to manage resources where the resources are owned, used and managed by the private individual or agency. So, unlike the state property regime, in the case of private property regime, there is no separation between the use rights, ownership rights and the decision making rights. Therefore, private property regime is supposed to be more stable, because there is a strong authority structure. The private individual which owns the resource can also restrict others from using the resource. So, therefore, it is ensured that resources will not be shared by many, resources will not be accessed or used by many people, and the decision making right also rests with the individual who owns the resource. So, therefore, it is believed that the person or the agency which owns the resource can take best decisions about the resource. So, therefore, there is a legal and social sanction to exclude other, to restrict other non users, and that provides an exclusive property right in the case of private property regimes. The ownership, use and management rights are combined, and it is one individual or one agency which exercises all these three rights over resource in the case of private property regimes. So, therefore, as a management regime, private property regime is more or less strong, it is more stable, because the three important property right arrangements, the three important property rights are combined and are held by one individual or one person. Now, let us discuss the third kind of resource management regime, that is common property regime. Common property regime is a kind of institutional arrangement where the property rights are vested in a group who can be distinguished from non users. So, therefore, common property regimes sometimes reside in between the private property regime and the state property regime. Unlike the private property regime and the state property regime, in the case of common property regime, the ownership of the resource and the use right of the resource is vested with a group. It is a group, a community or a group of individuals who hold the resource collectively, and it is this group or the community hold the rights of the resource in common, and they share the rights and duties among themselves. One of the important characteristics of common property regime is that they can exclude, they can restrict the non-members, those who do not belong to them, from using the resource. In that sense, common property regime is kind of a shared private property, where the community upon whom the management responsibility are bestowed, the community can restrict the non-members, the community can restrict outsiders from accessing the resource or from using the resource, and the community can share the resource among themselves. The fourth kind of institutional arrangement or the fourth kind of resource management regime is known as open access regime. Unlike the common property regime, the state property regime and the private property regime, where there is a kind of institutional arrangement, there is a kind of authority structure to own, use and decide over the resource. In the case of open access resources, property right arrangements do not exist. So, therefore, it is a kind of institutional arrangement where there is no clear cut distinction, there is no clear cut guidelines as to who will use these three important kind of rights. So, therefore, in that sense, open access resources seems like everyone's access, where anyone can access the resource, anyone can use the resource, and where there is no clear cut guideline who will use and who will be restricted or who will be excluded from using the resource. So, therefore, open access regimes, there is no clear cut authority structure. Unlike the other three regimes, the state property, private property and common property, where there is a clear cut authority structure, in the case of open access regimes, there is no clear cut authority structure as to who will use the resource and who can be restricted or excluded from use the resource. So, when talking about open access regimes, we need to make a distinction between right and privileges. In all the other three kind of regimes, or in all the other three kind of property management regimes, the state property management regime, the private property regime and the common property regime, there is an exclusive right. In the case of state property regime, the state can give the right to others to use, it can give the right to citizens to use. In the case of private property regime, it is the private individual who owns the right to use and decide over the resource, and in the case of common property regime, it is the community, the group who holds the right in common. Whereas, in the case of open access regime, there is no clear cut right regarding the resource. In the absence of right, what exists in open access regime is the privileges. Everyone have privileges to access the resource, everyone has privileges to use the resource, everyone has privileges to take benefit from the resource, but no one has any right. And because no one has any right, no one also have any duty to respect that right, because as we know that every time right is accompanied with duty. So, when it becomes someone's right over the resource, it becomes others' responsibility, others' duty to respect that right. So, therefore, in the case of state property right, state property regime, common property regime and private property regime, there is clear cut rights and duties over the resource. Whereas, in the case of open access regime, there is no one who can enjoy a kind of exclusive right over the resource, and everyone uses privileges. So, therefore, open access resources are most likely to be degraded, they are most vulnerable, because there is no clear cut rights and no clear cut duties and no clear cut authority structure. And most of our natural resources, they exist in the form of open access regimes, where there is no clear cut guidelines or there is no clear cut authority structure regarding who will use right over the resource. While discussing about these four property management regimes, there is a possibility that we may have a confusion regarding the common property regime and the open access regime. However, common property regimes are entirely different from open access regime. What I am trying to say that the resource may be the same, but what distinguishes is the resource management regime. The same resource can be used, the same resource can be managed under the common property regime and it can be managed as open access regime. So, let us see how these two management regimes are different from each other and what impact does it have on resource or the resource base. In the case of common property regime, the co-owners or the co-users enjoy exclusive right over the resource. As I just told that common property regimes are a kind of institutional arrangement where property rights are bestowed upon a group or a community. It is the group or the community which enjoys property right collectively or in common, and because they use rights over the resource collectively, they can exclude others, they can restrict others from using the resource. Whereas, in the case of open access, none enjoys right over the resource or no one enjoys right over the resource, and therefore, excluding others from the resource becomes difficult. In the case of open access, what everyone has is a kind of privilege. Now, when we see these resource management regimes in the context of resource, we may realize that the future of the resource or the availability of the resource will differ depending upon the management regime. For example, when a forest is managed under common property regime, the outcomes will be completely different than when it is managed as an open access. In the case of common property regime, or when a forest or water body is managed as a common property regime, there is a clear cut group or there is a clear cut community who uses rights over the resource, and therefore, by dint of these rights they can exclude others from using the resource. So, therefore, resources are shared, but at the same time it is not open for all. Common property resources are not open for all, it is only available for the community. So, when resources are used as common property, when natural resources are used as common property, the possibilities of degradation, the possibilities of resource depletion reduces, because the users or the group, the community can prohibit, can restrict, can exclude others from using the resource. Whereas, when the resource is used or when the resource is managed under the open access regime, there is no clear cut right. So, therefore, the resource is open to all and others cannot be restricted, and that will lead to free riding over the resource, and ultimately resources will be degraded. So, therefore, degradation of natural resources arises because they are more or less or mostly used as, or they are managed as open access resources or managed under open access regime. And when resources are managed upon open access regime, there is no clear cut duty, there is no clear cut right, and there is no clear cut authority structure. Whereas, when resources are managed under common property regime, there is a clear cut group who has a clear cut property right which is used collectively upon the resource. So, to summarize this part of the lecture, we may say that resource management regimes exist in 4 different forms: the state property regime, the private property regime, the common property regime, and the open access regime. And natural resources mostly exist in the form of open access regime, and therefore, there is a possibility of degradation of natural resources, because in the case of natural resources, when it is managed under open access regime, there is no clear cut authority as to who will have right and who will have duty and privileges over the resource. When they are managed as common property, there is a collective right over the resource, and therefore, there is a possibility that resources can be protected from degradation and they can be protected from depletion. So, therefore, resources can be managed under 4 different management regimes, and natural resources gets depleted or natural resources get degraded only when they are managed under the open access regime. So, therefore, forests get degraded, water body gets depleted when they are used and managed under open access regime without a clear cut authority structure, without a clear cut rights, and without a clear cut institutional arrangements.